Hi and welcome to Rose Red Homestead, and thank you for joining our community today for this video. I've been able to tell quite a bit about the people who are enjoying our community, our set of videos, and most of them are very safe canners. They are interested in knowing the real way, the safe way, how to can foods. We would very much like to get these videos out to as many people who are also like-minded, who want to do safe canning, who are working toward greater self-sufficiency and food security, along with emergency preparedness. And if you would like to help us in that endeavor, all you would need to do is just like this video if you end up liking it, share it with others, and subscribe if you haven't, because that helps YouTube feature our videos along the side when someone looks up a keyword, and then our videos appear there too, so we can get the word out. So today we are going to be doing Russian roulette canning, and this is by request of quite a few people. Pam, would you do a video on this and tell us why this isn't safe to can, or that? Or we've had lots of requests on that. So in order to understand what Russian roulette canning is, you have to know what Russian roulette is. And I'm sure that most of you know, but we do have a lot of viewers from around the globe, and so I'm just going to quickly explain it. Russian roulette is a game, a horrible, dangerous game that some people play using a handgun. And what they will do, they'll take an empty gun, and in that cylinder, the part that holds the rounds, they put one single round into one of the cylinders, and then they just spin it. And it spins around and around, and nobody knows where it stops. You can't look to see where it is. You hold the gun up to your head and you pull the trigger. And if it's a 5-shooter, what are your probabilities that you're not going to live to see morning? If it's a 6-shooter, what are those probabilities? And so with Russian roulette, it is all about probabilities. And for anyone who is not practicing safe canning, this is what I would say, and I don't want to be critical or point out anyone's faults or flaws in the way that they do things, but canning is all about the probabilities. How much of a probability are you willing to take to risk your family? For me, I want to reduce all risk. I want 0 probability that my family is going to be harmed by anything that I do with canning, and so that's what we present on our videos. So I have a few things set out that we're going to look at and talk about Russian roulette canning in just a moment. First of all, just let me start by saying that it is important to go to a true source, a valid source, to get tested recipes. Well, what are those sources? The USDA, the National Center for Home Food Preparation, any one of the state's extension offices where they have tested recipes using safe canning methodologies. You know, I'm reminded of that story once because I've heard a lot of criticism has come forward on some of our comments on some of our videos, because they accuse me of going back to the dark ages because I practice safe canning, because everybody knows for generations we've done it this other way, or my mother did it, or my grandmother, and we've done it this way our whole lives and nobody's ever died. And that's true. That is really true. A lot of people do crazy things with canning and they don't die. But the problem is those probabilities. What's the probability? So I'm reminded of a story that I read a long time ago about a young married woman who invited her grandmother over for Easter dinner. And so the young woman was preparing the ham. It was a beautiful big ham. And right before she put it in the oven, she cut it in half and put it in 2 pans and then slipped it in her oven. And the grandmother was a little bit puzzled. And so the grandmother said, "Well, sweetheart, why are you cutting the ham in half?" And the young woman turned to her grandmother and said, "Well, Grams, my gosh, I spent Easter dinner at your house all the time, and that's how you did it. So I'm just doing it how you did it." And the grandmother just threw her head back and laughed, and she said, "Oh, my dear, the reason that I had to cut hams in half is because my oven was too small." And so sometimes we do things that for generations before us they have done. We emulate that when we don't even really know the reasons why. I had one grandmother who canned, and of course my mother who canned. And yes, they didn't do things the same way that I do them now because I have more scientific knowledge. But I'll tell you one thing, my mother and that particular grandmother, they were both really smart. And I just can't help but think if they were alive today, they would be embracing the safe practices regardless of what their traditions were in generations previous. So let's get right down to these foods. And I found these foods. I always do research before I do a video like this. I found these Russian roulette canning foods on both the National Center for Home Canning, for Home Food Preservation, and also USDA. But I found really a lot of them on university extension offices. And so they really want to get this word out. So let's help them get it out. So let's start. First, we're going to start with butter. There are a zillion recipes and YouTubes on the internet about how to can butter safely. One thing that you can always tell about whether or not something is a tested recipe is by the variation in the number of processes that people use to do something like canning butter. I couldn't find any two videos that did it in exactly the same way. But basically what happens is people melt the butter wherever, in a pan or in the oven. The jars are hot. They pour the butter into the jar, and then they quickly put a lid on and with a ring and screw it down. And because the jar is hot and the butter is hot, you'll ultimately get a seal. And you have to walk around every hour or so and shake the butter so that it doesn't separate while it is cooling down. All right, so what's the matter with this picture? First of all, the practice that is used is not water bath canning, and it is not pressure canning. It is called open kettle canning. Open kettle canning occurs when you might put hot food in a jar, and then you can quickly put the lid on, and yes, it forms a vacuum. And does this look like canning? Yes, it looks like canning, maybe, unless we define canning as then processing foods in a closed jar in a water environment until the proper temperature, and in case of pressure canning, pressure has been reached. That's what real canning is. Real canning is not open kettle canning because, of course, it's open to the air. Things can get in it before you pop that lid on. And people go through all kinds of gyrations to make it appear to be safe. So let's find out why. Why is it not safe for us to do open kettle canning? Or even if after we put the butter in there, if we water bath it for a little while, does that make it safe? Well, some people do that, but nobody does the same amount of time in water bath because there is no tested recipe for doing that. So they just think in their head, well, I think probably about 20 minutes should do it. Some people even pressure can it. Yikes! You want to pressure can butter? How long do you do it and at what pressure? So here is the big danger in attempting to can butter. And it is the same danger. It is the number one enemy of every one of these things we're going to be talking about today. And that is that little pesky bacteria known as Clostridium botulinum that produces the botulism toxin. And that toxin can make us very, very sick, and it can even kill us. Now, the probabilities are not very high that we're going to get botulism. There are not very many cases. But again, what probabilities are you willing to live with? I'm not willing to live with any of those. So butter is made up of fat, mostly fat, water, and milk solids, protein. Okay, so this is low acid. Botulism can be in this, the botulism spores. Let me just interrupt myself here for a moment. I have talked about botulism in 3 or 4, maybe more videos. I think it's time that I do a special single video on botulism so we don't have to go plowing through a bunch of our older videos trying to figure out the whole story. So I'm going to be doing that here really soon. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the life cycle, but just to know that the spores move from the sleeping state, if we could call it that, to the vegetative state where they grow and reproduce, and that is when they produce that toxin. And when do they do that? Moisture, well, yeah, we've got water in here. Low acid, oh yeah, we've got the low acid right here. And the third thing is temperature. Well, your pantry, my pantry, is just about the right temperature for that organism to go to the vegetative state and produce the toxin. And so stay away from canning butter. Now, I'm going to do one little caveat here because many of you may have watched my video on making ghee. Now, does this look like it's canned? It does. This ghee was processed June 6th of 20. And so we're coming up here on a year in about 4 more months. This will be a year. This is sat out on our canning shelves for nearly a year, and it is very shelf stable, and it will be for months and months and maybe even years to come. I do not can this, even though it looks like it. If you watch that video, you will see that I start with butter. I boil that butter, and you'll see a lot of steam coming off. I'm getting rid of the water, and then I boil that butter until there is a caramelized crust on the bottom. What's that caramelized crust? The milk solids and protein. So what's left? The fat. It's 100% fat, and bacteria is not going to grow in 100% fat. And so I do what looks like open kettle canning with this. I pour the hot butter into hot jars. I pop the lid on, and yes, it seals, but I don't water bath it. I don't pressure process it. It is just making it shelf stable. I never claim that I am canning when I do this. And this is very safe to do because we have eliminated the things that botulism really needs here. Okay, what is next? Another dairy product, which is milk. And I know some people have cows and they produce a lot of milk, and there are dozens of YouTube videos on how to properly can milk. Well, no, they're not, because not one of them uses the same procedure, and all of them claim to be safe. There is no tested recipe. Every single reference that I looked at said do not pressure can milk. Same reason. Low acid, a lot of water in here, a lot of fat, and it interferes with the processing. It has not been tested. Yes, you can buy canned milk on this grocery store shelves. We do not in our homes even begin to have the correct equipment in order to safely can milk. Some people water bath it, other people pressure can it. Stay away from it completely. Botulism is still a probability here, even if it's slight. All right, well, what about cheese? Same thing as other dairy products. What does this contain? It contains water, contains milk solids, it is low acid, and mostly the ones that I looked at, the videos that I looked at, did this with the open kettle method as well. Some people did water bath after that, but it is not safe. It is still a probability that if botulism spores are in the cheese or on the cheese or get on the cheese during some time of this process, that they can produce the botulism toxin. Now, every one of the extension offices that I looked at was especially warning us about soft cheeses like cream cheese. People are doing that now, and those are especially dangerous and more susceptible than others to the botulism infestation. There are some really hard cheeses that can be coated in wax and stored on pantry shelves for years and years, but not canning. Okay, so a lot of times we may be tempted in our soup recipes in particular to add pasta or to thicken things with cornstarch, or maybe to add a little bit of rice to the recipe. These three things are all on the do not can. They are on the Russian roulette list. And that is because they interfere with the heat getting evenly dispersed throughout the jar. And pasta especially is so frothy when it boils. And so that can also froth up and break the seal so that things don't properly seal. But stay away from these things as thickeners. If you need to thicken something, and I have illustrated this in several of our videos as well, then thicken it after you open the soup. Add the pasta to it after you open the jar. And the same thing with the thickeners, and flour is in this category as well. Okay, so what about cured meat? This is our peppered bacon. We just love this peppered bacon. And if you have watched our very first video was canning beans. And you will notice that I dropped a piece of bacon into every jar. Well, I should probably take that video down because that was not safe, but I did not know it at the time. The reason, this is a cured meat, along with ham and some sausage, anything that has been put through a different process. The reason, again, is botulism, that we should not can these is, what do we have in terms of processing directions? Those processing directions for meats are for fresh meat. Cured meat has a different density. No testing has been done on these. Now there are a couple of exceptions. We just did a video on Boston baked beans. The recipe that I followed was a tested recipe, and it said that I could put a little cube of salt pork in every jar, which I did. But I know people that have canned chunks of ham and other cured meats, and there are the probabilities again. It's pretty scary. And so stay away from canning cured meats except in tested recipes. I have 2 of them that we've done videos on in the Boston baked beans, and the second one is split pea soup. And both of those followed tested recipes, so follow your tested recipes. The last one I want to talk about was warning after warning after warning after warning. And there is a fairly new trend where you take a canning jar and you bake bread in it, or you make a cake in it and in the jar, and when it comes out of the oven, or even before you completely take it out, you pop the lid on and crank it down, let it cool. It forms a seal, and people think that then it is safe. This is no guarantee that the food is safe in here. And this is especially dangerous because think of the things that are in a cake or bread. Moisture, low acid. It's a perfect environment, absolutely perfect. Those little botulism critters would be rejoicing if we did that and put these on our shelves. And so some people say, oh, well, I do it, but they don't last very long on my shelf. Okay, suit yourself. There's probabilities there, and I'm not going to be doing any of that. Never, never, never would I do that. Now, you can find jarred breads and jarred cakes in the grocery store. The difference is they add a whole ton of other stuff, chemicals, as a preservative and to kill any possible other critters that might be in there. Now, because we live in a free society and because we are intelligent people, we think because something is done one way, it's okay to extrapolate that to something that is not a tested recipe. And that is where a lot of people get in trouble. They think that, oh, because I can process beef chunks at this amount of time, depending on the size of the jar, I can cut up ham and do the same thing. So that's also a danger, is when we extrapolate from one situation to another, but we change some of the elements of that extrapolation that are totally different from what the tested recipe is. So I would just like to encourage all of us, be safe. Don't play Russian roulette canning, and always, always follow tested recipes. So I hope that we can continue in our community to be safe and to encourage one another. There are lots of really good comments coming in all the time on our videos. It's fun to just read down and see how other people do things. There are wonderful suggestions. And when we did our video on the dangers of doing oven dry canning, or oven canning of dry foods, there were lots and lots of people who said, I saw this on YouTube and I just didn't feel right about it. It didn't look right about it. So I'm so glad that you did a video on that. So if you get that feeling in your gut where, ooh, this just doesn't feel right to me, then don't do it. Follow your inclinations, especially if you are knowledge-based in what is a good canning procedure. So let's all be safe and hope this was useful, and we will see you at our next video.